appreciate that introduction. I think I'm going to change some of my approach with the students I'm working with, Ben. So thank you for that insight. You know, every day we make choices. And sometimes they're automatic, and they're about small things that don't matter much. And then other times they're a little more important. We got to put some thought into it. But every once in a while, we make a choice that is so consequential that it impacts everything that happens afterwards. In fact, these choices we make actually shape the future. The Wall Street Journal recently published an article about the best performing firms of the past 30 years. So from 1985 to present, these firms outperform rivals and the S&P 500 by double. It's astonishing. And if you looked at the list, some of the names on the list you would recognize, some you wouldn't. But you might not be surprised to know that there are a lot of differences. They're located in different parts of the world. They're different kind of customers, different products. They compete in different industries in different ways. But the most remarkable thing is that these companies, this list of different companies that outperform so many others, actually all share one thing in common. It's remarkable. They almost didn't make it. An analyst looking at this list noted that each one of these companies, if you looked at their history, each of them experienced what he called a near-death experience. As a matter of fact, another author commenting on this research in an article entitled "Companies Can't Be Great Unless They Almost Failed," said that these weren't just minor decisions, minor bumps in the road like a failed product here or maybe a bad quarter of earnings. These were industry-shifting challenges. In fact, if you look at the writing on these things, all of them had to make an important choice. They were confronted with one of those fork-in-the-road moments. Now, as an adjunct professor here at Westminster College, I'm passionate about working with students as we examine the choices companies make when they face opportunities or threats in their competitive environment. And this, in the business world, is known as strategy. And I'm passionate about strategy. And what I like most about strategy is that at the end of the day, it's a term that's used and misused so much, sometimes it confuses all meaning. But the fact is, strategy is nothing more than choice. It's the choices companies make when confronted with a fork-in-the-road moment. And they define the things they will do and the things they will not do. They're placing strategic bets, if you will, on the future. One way to think about strategy is that it's a story. It's actually a narrative that companies craft and create to explain how they will compete into the future. Well, what I've found as I've looked at company strategy and all these different business cases is there are a lot of important lessons that you and I can glean from the way that companies have encountered and overcome the challenges they face. And I want to talk about one today, perhaps the most important one, which is to say, this lesson is so important that I believe if we get this one wrong, it probably doesn't matter what else we get right. This lesson is so critical that it has the power to shape our future. In 1960, Harvard business professor Theodore Levitt wrote what is now one of the most famous business articles on the subject of marketing and strategy. His article was entitled "Marketing Myopia," and in this article, as should come as no surprise, Levitt looked at different organizations and industries, and he tried to identify why was it that industries that were once the poster child of enterprise and opportunity eventually reached decline and eventually were threatened their very existence. And his now famous example, Levitt looked at the railroad industry. And he notes that at a period of time, the railroad industries connected one coast of our country to the other, enabled mass production of goods and services, created new wealth and jobs, and things were going very well. But then, as time went on and technology developed, another industry started to rise up around the railroads, which we broadly now refer to as the transportation industry. Levitt says in this industry, airplanes were a new entrant, and we saw the automobile and buses. In fact, Levitt even mentions the telephone. And so the railroads came to a fork-in-the-road moment. They had to make a choice of how they would define themselves in the face of this challenge or potentially opportunity. Would they see themselves as part of this wider transportation industry? They already had the infrastructure, they had the employees, they had all the investments of decades of investments. Would they seek an opportunity to redefine themselves and capture some of this new value? So what did the railroads do? Well, this is important for you and I, because the way Levitt says this resonates. He said, the railroads made a choice. They stopped growing. The railroads defined this problem so narrowly, hearkening back to the title of his article, Marketing Myopia, they became myopic. And they decided not to define themselves in a way that would include the railroads in this new transportation industry, but in fact, they got narrow and said, we're the railroads, we're in the railroad industry, that's a threat, we can't change it, can't take part in it. And eventually, that industry entered into decline, and as we know presently, it went into a series of profit losses and restructuring. Well, that's the lesson I want to share with you today. The way we define the challenges we face, the choices we make when we confront that fork-in-the-road moment, impact everything that happens after, whether we go on to succeed or if we experience failure. Now, remarkably, not many years after Levitt published Marketing Myopia, a team of psychology researchers were trying to come to an explanation of why it is some people, in the face of challenge, give up, and others persist. One of these researchers was a young man by the name of Martin Seligman. That name might resonate with some of you. Martin Seligman would go on to become the president of the American Psychological Association, but he would also become the founding father of the School of Positive Psychology, which represented a major shift in the disease model that psychologists had studied for so long. And what these team of researchers discovered, that there was something at the core that delineated those that persisted, and showed grit, and persisted in the face of obstacles, and others that gave up. Those that experienced depression, anxiety, and helplessness. And what the team of psychologists termed this was their explanatory style. In other words, the way these individuals explained the challenge that they faced would ultimately determine where they would fall. In fact, it gets even more specific. Seligman and the team of research identified 3 key components to our explanatory style that would ultimately determine whether we succeeded and persisted or experienced anxiety and failure. Number 1, what they determined is that if we were able to see it as temporary versus permanent. Number 2, if we saw it as local rather than universal. And number 3, if we perceived it as changeable rather than immutable, unchangeable. So let's look at that for a minute there. Let's put that into everyday speak. If you are an individual who has an explanatory style that sees something as temporary, you're likely to say when you meet an obstacle, this is not going to last forever. As a matter of fact, it might be over soon. If you're somebody that sees the obstacle as local instead of universal, you would likely say, this is just one situation. My life is a combination of many situations. This is just one. And in terms of changeability, if you are somebody in your explanatory style, when you meet a challenge, if you perceive it as changeable, you are likely to say, I can do something about this. I am not helpless. That is remarkable. What the team of psychologists discovered is what I'm talking about today. The choices we make when we are confronted with an obstacle and the way we define our challenges ultimately determine whether we go on to persist, demonstrate grit, and succeed, or if we experience anxiety, failure, and we go on to experience helplessness. Well, there's a lot of great examples in the world of business of people that came to a challenge, a fork in the road, and had to craft an explanatory style, had to get strategic about how they would overcome this problem. I think about Thomas Edison, an inventor that literally changed the world, sitting across the table from a reporter one day who said, "Mr. Edison, on this project you have failed over 1,000 times. Why in the world do you persist?" And Edison responds, "I haven't failed 1,000 times. I've simply discovered 1,000 different ways this will not work." How about that for an explanatory style in the face of failure? What about Steve Jobs? Steve Jobs, another incredible inventor, changed each one of our lives, and most of us today have an Apple product in our pocket or here with us. Steve Jobs pours his heart and soul into Apple, creates this company in the garage. He forms a board of directors. He brings on friends to help him build this enterprise. As a matter of fact, he recruits talent that after so many years fire Steve Jobs. And he leaves Apple. And looking back on this challenge, this fork in the road moment, what does Jobs say? How does he explain it? Well, Jobs would go on, as most of you know, and acquire a little-known company by the name of Pixar that would go on to create some of the most incredible animated films of recent memory. And Jobs said, "This time period for me unlocked years and years of creativity." And when Jobs would go back to Apple, he would bring with him this creativity that would unlock the iPhone, iTunes, and the iPad. How about that for explanatory style? Months before Apple would be bankrupt, they went back to Jobs, and instead of turning his back, experiencing failure, helplessness, he brought back this lesson of creativity and turned Apple around to one of the most admired companies on the planet today. Well, outside of these business examples, there are other examples that speak more poignantly about this idea of how we craft the stories, the strategies that we embrace in the face of challenge. And perhaps there's no better example than that of Viktor Frankl. Some of you know the name Viktor Frankl. He's a Holocaust survivor. He spent years in Nazi concentration camps, and some of the worst. As a matter of fact, he was in Dachau and he went to Auschwitz. While in these concentration camps, Mr. Frankl lost his mother and his father. He lost his young wife and a sibling. Can you imagine the very system designed to rob a person of their dignity, of their humanity, designed to kill? And indeed, millions of people died in concentration camps. And yet, Viktor Frankl, in the darkness of this unbelievable obstacle, this challenge that I cannot even wrap my mind around, what is it that he brought back from this abyss? What is it that he brought to us? Well, in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, one of my favorite books of all time, Frankl says this: "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." One slide, one takeaway today. You see, every day we make choices. Some of them are automatic, and some of them are about small things. Others require a little more effort, a little more thought. But every once in a while, we have to make a choice that is so profound, so consequential, that it'll shape everything that happens after. And the dirty secret is this: we don't get to choose the obstacles, the duration, the heartache, the timing. Never. They happen. But we are always free to choose. And whatever choice we make, the way we define the challenge in front of us, not only shapes the outcome, it also shapes the people that we become. Thank you very much. Thank you.